So, death is a weird thing. It's probably one of the only things that all of us have in common. Okay, whether or not we've experienced it yet, we're all going to. The mortality rate is still hovering right around 100% for all of us, okay? It's something we all have in common, and yet we don't really enjoy talking about it. And it's kind of understandable. It's personal. It's hard to talk about. It brings up a lot of questions about things that are not necessarily perfectly clear, some things that are unknown. And it brings up some memories, some things of hurt and pain, and that's okay. I understand that. Jesus knows all of those sorrows. He knows all of the grief that death brings. He knows all the pain. He knows the sting of it. And he lived his life knowing full well that in order for us to have life, it meant his own death. He tried to tell his disciples. He foretold it. He tried to explain what was going to happen. He knew who would betray him. He knew how he would be put on trial, and he knew how he would be executed. His death was always on his mind. But there were two things more important than that, more powerful. And that was his obedience to his Father, what God the Father wanted, and his love for you and his love for me. Those were more powerful than death itself. So Jesus tasted death. He understands our hurt. He understands our grief. He understands our sorrow and pain. And we can't for a second think that he doesn't. This morning we're going to talk about Lazarus. And this story, I think a lot of times, even as I was starting to prepare and read and study, I had in my mind we're going to talk about death and dying and what that looks like. And really, this story is not about death. This story is absolutely, unequivocally about life. It's not about the rituals that surround death, though they're there in this passage. It's not about the grief and the pain, but they're there. It's about life. It's about Jesus giving life. So if you would settle in with me for the next 20, 25 minutes or so, and would you allow God, through his word, to kind of impress on your heart a little bit? Maybe there's something that's there that's hurting. And would you allow the Holy Spirit, Jesus himself, to be life to you, to be a balm to those hurts? Would you allow that just for a little bit this morning? Would you allow him to enter into your world and be present with you? Because he would love to do that. So let me set the scene a little bit for what's going on in John chapter 11. And we skip chapter 10 because Pastor Mark's going to teach about that next week. He really wanted that one. So I was like, all right, we'll go out of order a little bit. So we're in chapter 11. This is the story of Lazarus, and we probably have heard it. We've heard it talked on. We know it a little bit. But let me set the scene. So last week we talked about Jesus healing a blind man. He had this crazy interaction with these Pharisees that were all mad, and they end up kind of mad at him. And Jesus, right before that, they were going to stone him. They wanted him dead. And so Jesus kind of moves out of Jerusalem to a safer place, kind of in solitude a little bit with his disciples. And he's here, and he's not going into Jerusalem. It's dangerous for him. And Martha and Mary send a messenger to Jesus because their brother Lazarus is sick. And the messenger comes to Jesus and his disciples and says, hey, the one whom you love, he's fallen ill. And Jesus knew right away it was Lazarus that was fallen ill because he loved this family. He knew them really well. And so these people came and they told Jesus, and he kind of just goes, okay. And he tells the disciple, this is not going to end in death. This will not end in death for the glory of God. And so everyone's kind of like, okay, cool, let's go. And Jesus doesn't leave right away. He waits 2 days, okay? So instead of departing right away immediately to go see his sick friend, he waits 2 days. And then he says, hey, all right, let's go. Let's go to Bethany, which is really close to Jerusalem. Now, a couple things to note. Martha and Mary knew the risk that Jesus ran when he would have come back to Bethany. It was so close to Jerusalem, and it would have been a very public kind of out there path to get there. And so it would have been really dangerous for Jesus to go and see his friend Lazarus. And Martha and Mary had to weigh that against, Lazarus is really sick. We need Jesus to come and be here with him. We want him to see him. And so they ask him that, and they decide it's important enough to send for Jesus. And he waits 2 days, and then he says, let's go. And his disciples are kind of looking at him like, Jesus, like, it's really dangerous for you to go. Like, they want to kill you. They want you dead. The Pharisees are out to get you. If you're seen, you're going to get arrested. And Jesus says, we're going to go. Look, Lazarus has fallen asleep. And his disciples kind of look at him like, why don't you just tell him to wake up? And he goes, no, you're not getting it. He's dead. Lazarus has died. But I'm glad I wasn't there so that when we go, you're going to see God's glory revealed. And it's this really interesting thing. And I bet the disciples were kind of like, what do you mean? Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And so Thomas, and he's the only one disciple mentioned by name in this, Thomas goes, all right, let's all go so we can die too. And it's this, at first I read it, I was like, this is sarcastic. What the heck is this guy talking about? Like, why would he say something like that? But in reality, he thought like, hey, we need to be with Jesus. Like, he's our master. He's our Lord. We're going to go with him. And if he's going down, we're all going down. Let's go. And so we pick up in verse 17. And this is, so they're on their way, and they're just outside Bethany, and they haven't actually come into the village yet. And it says this, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, remember, Jesus waited 2. And the journey it would have taken a messenger to find Jesus, it probably took him about a day to get from Bethany to where Jesus was. So now we have 3 days there, and then another day's journey for Jesus and the disciples to get to Bethany. So we have 4 days. You do the math. When the messenger left, it seems as though Lazarus died shortly after that, if not immediately. And so Jesus probably knew that. And he said, well, let's wait. And he waited 2 days, and it took him another day to get there. And so 4 days have passed, and Lazarus has been dead. And the tradition and the custom is to bury him quickly. And so he was buried in a grave, and they had rolled the stone, and he had been dressed by his family to preserve him, and he was in the grave. Now, there was also another kind of ritual tradition that after 3 days, in this time, they would actually open the grave up to make sure this person wasn't actually alive, which is kind of weird to me. It's just strange. So that time had passed too, because they thought that the spirit would hover around for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, decomposition started to set in really bad, and so the spirit would leave. That's what they thought. And so they would check to make sure they weren't alive. So Jesus had let 4 days pass. Like, he could have gone immediately, and Lazarus probably still would have been dead. But he let 4 days pass to show that Lazarus was in the tomb, he was dead. Like, it was over. His life had ended. And he didn't want any rumors of like, oh, he just kind of like resuscitated him, gave him CPR, and brought him back to life. It was good. No, he was in the tomb, and everyone knew it. So, this is what happens. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. In that time, grieving and mourning wasn't a really private thing that you got to do by yourself. You would have people that would come around you and grieve and mourn with you for a week. They would be by you and do whatever you needed. And so you kind of had this group of people that cared about you, that loved you, and these people were there with Mary and Martha, grieving and mourning the loss of Lazarus. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. And I know there's another story in Luke of Mary and Martha and kind of their interaction with Jesus and what happens there. And I don't want to read that into this story, so we'll just stick to this one. Martha ran out to meet Jesus. And part of that is probably customary. She was responsible for going and greeting guests as they would come to mourn with them. And so she ran out to meet Jesus. And Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. So Martha has this like breakdown, and it's okay that she does. She lost her brother, and she goes, Jesus, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. But I know that whatever you ask God, whatever you ask him, he's going to give you. And so she has this motive. She kind of corrects herself knowing that, but she's still hurting. That's okay. And Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And now there was a belief among the Jews that there would be a resurrection at the end of days. And Martha goes, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So she was kind of agreeing, like, yeah, of course, I believe that. And she goes, no. Listen, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Martha, there's no way she could have grasped what Jesus was saying. I think she trusted him. She trusted everything she knew about him. But what Jesus just said to her, there's no way she could have grasped. She probably related it back to the end time resurrection, the end day resurrection. She said, "Yeah, I believe it. And I trust you, Jesus. I believe you're who you say you are." But Jesus was saying, look, I am something different. He's made a couple I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am living water. I am the light. And now he claims, I'm the resurrection and the life. Bringing someone from the dead and giving them life. Not only do I possess the power to do that, in and of itself, that is who I am. That is what I'm here to do. It is my essence. I am life. There's no way Mary or Martha could have understood that. But she says, yes, whatever I know of you, I trust that what you're saying is true. It's the crux of our faith. We talk all the time how we're moved from death and sin to alive in Christ because of his death on the cross. And so for us to really grasp it, I think this story is really, really important. This story and understanding what happened between Jesus and Lazarus. And so let's read on to see what Jesus meant by that. So when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. So now it's Mary's turn to run out to him. And now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews were with her in the house, consoling her, Mary saw Mary rise quickly and go out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. So this kind of entourage, this group of people that was mourning with Mary was like, hey, let's go with her. She's going to the tomb to weep. Let's be with her. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The exact same thing that Martha said. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, the idea of weeping here, I don't think our translation does it real justice. Because I think when we think of weeping, we think of this like kind of curled up, like whisper sobbing kind of like just to ourselves. But this weeping was this loud wailing and crying that people around would have heard. And so Mary was crying and weeping. And when Jesus saw her, it says he was deeply troubled in his spirit. Now, that is also an interesting phrase. This is the Greek. The Greek word is embrimahomai. Okay? It's really hard to say. I don't know why. But it doesn't carry the connotation that I think our translation gives it. That greatly troubled in his spirit. It seems like he's in distress, kind of, like that. But this word it actually means to snort in anger. Like a war horse would snort. Okay, have you ever seen a movie where like it's like the morning and the troops are getting ready for battle and they're on these horses and they like snort and the hot breath goes into the cold air and it like kind of steams? That's what I think of, okay? That's the image that this word should kind of draw us to. To snort with anger, to have indignation. Why was Jesus so angry? Who was he angry with? Because he wasn't just greatly distressed, he was downright furious. This is another example of Jesus being angry. A lot of times we only think of him in the temple, clearing the temple. This is a great example. But what was he so angry about? One of the writers, as I was reading, this is what he wrote. He said, he is overcome by the futility of this sorrowful scene in light of the resurrection. God's people possess knowledge of life, and they should possess a faith that claims victory at the grave. But here they stand, overcome in seeming defeat, and here stands the one in whom victory, life, and resurrection are powerful realities. Jesus is angry at death itself and the devastation it brings. Jesus was mad at death. Because when he was with God at creation, when Adam and Eve were in the garden before the fall, before sin entered the world and death through sin, before that happened, that's what it was supposed to be like. the pain and the hurt and the grief that Mary and Martha and even the folks around them were feeling and experiencing, Jesus was angry at death for bringing that kind of devastation into people's lives. He was furious at that. And he knew what was going to happen. He knew that what he was going to offer was life. He knew that was coming. And he was mad that had happened because it's not the way it was supposed to be. That's not how it was supposed to look. Jesus was mad about that. It says this, and he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And the shortest verse in the Bible, verse 35, Jesus wept. And I love that because I think we get a picture of Jesus' humanity. It hurt him too. He had sorrow, he had grief. His friend Lazarus had died. And yet all the time, he knew he was going to bring him back to life. We know Lazarus raises from the dead. Why did he weep? He was angry at death, but why did he weep? I think his heart broke for the people that were so hurt. I think Jesus loved them desperately, and he saw how hurt they were. And he knew what caused the pain. He had experienced it himself. He was walking through that range of emotions, and he loved them. And so Jesus wept. Jesus cried for his friend that had died. He cried for his friends that were missing him, that loved him dearly. Jesus wept. And so the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" That's a fair question. Couldn't he have kept him from dying? But remember, Jesus at the beginning of the story told them, he said, "Hey, this will not end in death, and you're going to see it because God's glory is going to be revealed through what's going to happen." And he told the disciples, "I'm glad I wasn't there because you're going to see God's glory revealed." And so we come to this final part, and Lazarus, I'm just going to read this. This won't be on the slides. This is the last little bit of this interaction. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, and that word comes back, that anger, that furious, that frustration with death, deeply moved again, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." And I love that he says that because that means that this isn't the first time Jesus prayed about this. When the messengers came to tell him that Lazarus was sick, I guarantee Jesus was in conversation with his dad, with his Father in heaven. He was talking to him about it. What are we going to do? And he knew God's glory was going to be revealed. And so he says this, and he even says this, "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." So he says it out loud for the good of the people around him, so that they would know who sent Jesus. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The 3 questions that I normally try to answer on a Sunday morning are what, so what, and now what. And the what and so what, hopefully, are pretty clear. The what is this story, Jesus raised a man from the dead, and there's symbolism in it, but let's not miss this miracle that actually happened. This isn't a story made up. This isn't something that's just kind of like, hey, this would illustrate a really good point. This actually happened. And why is it important? I was on Facebook yesterday, and there was a couple that, when Christy and I found out we were pregnant with Adeline, we went to the doctor, and this couple was there with us as well. And they ended up going to the same church as we did, and we met them for the first time there, and they had this baby boy as well, right around the same age as Adeline. And I just looked on Facebook last night, and that was 3.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and this wife just passed away from cancer. Death is everywhere. It's all around us. We can't avoid it. If you want to know why this story is important, just read the obituaries today. Scroll through Facebook, you see people in pain and hurting because of loss. That's a reality in our world. But what do we do with knowing that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead? See, we can kind of step back and know the full picture. We know that eventually Jesus dies on the cross, and he actually gets buried, and then he raises again. and now he's alive. And that's one of the best parts about our faith, about Christianity, is that our God isn't dead. We worship a God that's fully alive. And I love that. But one of the things we always talk about, one of the things that Mark and I will say all the time, is that Jesus didn't come to get us out of death. He came to get us into life. And I've struggled with, how does that actually play out in real life? How does that actually work? And I think this story illustrates it. This story kind of hit that home for me. Lazarus experienced a physical death. His family grieved and mourned, and it's okay. Jesus grieved and mourned. But Jesus gave him life, a physical new life. And it was a symbol of what he does spiritually for each of us. He gives us new life. He got Lazarus physically out of death, and he gave him life. And I start to think about how Lazarus lived. What would his life have looked like after that interaction? Do you think he went back to living the same way he did? I can't imagine he would have. That's the beauty of this story, is there's no way. He probably noticed things differently. He probably cared about folks differently. Probably loved differently, saw the world in a different way because of what Jesus had done for him. Jesus gave him life. And that's the same life that he offers to me and he offers to you through his death and resurrection. He offers us that resurrection life, and it starts now. It's not some eternal thing that's way off in the future. It starts now. And as I read this story, this never occurred to me. Jesus didn't make Lazarus immortal. Lazarus died again, which I don't know of any other human being in history that would have experienced that. But I would bet his experience with that the second time, I'm sure there was sorrow and fear in the depths of his soul. But when he started to think about it, he knew he wasn't going there alone. He knew Jesus had power over that grave, and he believed that Jesus did. And so for us, as we think about, there's a verse in Matthew where Jesus tells his disciples, look, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Jesus was beckoning us to die to ourselves. Jesus was beckoning us to give up on our own life and take on his, because his is better. His will bring beauty and goodness and joy. That resurrection life, he was calling us to that then. And he's calling us to that now. And so as we think about in John 10, where Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I've come that they may have life and have it abundantly, have it to the full. That's the life. Imagine how Lazarus would have lived. Here's the crazy thing. After Lazarus was resurrected, people started hearing about his story, and they started following Jesus because of his life. The Pharisees did not like that. And so they plotted to kill Lazarus too. Not just Jesus, but Lazarus was now in on it. And Jesus is saying, look, if you lose your life for my sake, you're going to find it. I have life. I am the resurrection and the life. And so as we approach that thought in our minds, we don't have to be afraid of it. Can sorrow and joy coexist? Can it commingle at the same time with that idea of mortality? I believe it can. I believe in Jesus it does. Because Jesus could look ahead beyond what was happening with Lazarus, beyond the sorrow and the grief that was experienced there. He looked ahead to the cross and knew, I'm going to give life to the full. That's what I offer. I am the resurrection life. Get in on it now. It doesn't have to wait till eternity. It starts now when you surrender your life to me, when you take up your cross and follow me. And I think that's what Jesus wants us to know. This story is an incredible, incredible miracle, but don't miss the offer of life in it. It's not about death. Jesus comes to give life. Comes to give life to the full, resurrection life. And I love that about him. I love that about him. We're going to watch a video to end, and it's just a song, and I want you to just listen to what the lyrics say. It's just a really neat song, so we'll end with that.